Hi everybody, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to be talking about accessibility to testing with Chrome DevTools. And just so you know what's expecting you, a lot of cat memes, so that we can all still have some fun. I'm going to talk about the basics of accessibility, how to make a case for it, because turns out that's a lot of the work already, and then how we can actually find accessibility issues and how we can deal with them when we found them. We're going to have a look at some tools and talk about what's needed to actually create the shift. The slides and lots of the resources that I'm going to mention will be in the end, so don't worry if you don't catch everything. You can also just go there after and peruse at your own time. Alrighty, just really quickly, so you know who's talking to you and showing you all those cats. My name is Josefine. I'm an accessibility engineer and certified accessibility professional. I currently work at Storyblok. Storyblok is a headless CMS, and I'm a GDE in web tech, so Google Developer Expert, which also explains my love for Chrome, right? And in my free time, I hang upside down a lot in like circusy elements, so that's also something to know about me. Anyway, and yeah, I think it was mentioned before, you can ask anything afterwards related to accessibility, but if you'd rather not do that, you can also shoot me an email or find me on LinkedIn and ask any questions that you have afterwards. Alrighty, let's dive in. So what is web accessibility and what is really our goal here? So our goal is to comply with web standards. And more specifically, we want to comply with the WCAG, so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So for everything in tech, we have documentation, right? And that's the documentation that we're referring to in terms of accessibility. Maybe show of hands, who has worked with accessibility before? A lot of people, so I'm not telling you anything new until now. Perfect, but this is what I'm referring to, right? And then there's 3 different levels, just for those who maybe not know. We have A, which is kind of the minimum, quote unquote, double A, and triple A, which is the strictest. And that applies mostly to government instances, for example, institutions, and the double A is kind of the middle ground, and what I refer to mostly. Oh God, I'm so sorry. I have been battling with a cold a little bit. I'm so sorry if that happens again. So what we're also aiming to do is create context, right, and different means of interacting with our content. There are the POUR principles, is what they're called. So the accessibility space loves their acronyms and loves shortening things. And POUR stands for, we want to make our content perceivable, we want to make it operable, understandable, and robust for many different kinds of user agents, right? And so whenever you're thinking about, like, what am I doing or why am I doing this, usually you can bring it back to these principles and on an abstract layer, right? You don't have to, but for some folks that helps kind of contextualize, like, why are we doing this? And so when I started out in the accessibility space, I was very motivated, I was very determined to make everything accessible 100% for everybody, and I learned really quickly that that's not going to be an option, right? But what we can do is reduce barriers, eliminate some of the barriers, and try really hard not to create new ones, so that we can, in the long run, create more accessible web experiences. And while there are many good reasons to care about accessibility, and I hope you're here because you have at least one good reason to care about it, usually that's not really enough when talking to any kind of business stakeholders. I'm so sorry. And so when you are talking to people and try and convince them that accessibility is something that they should care about, I was really hoping this would go away. 1 second. Thank you for bearing with me. Oh, this is harder than I thought. Okay, we'll try. Access to information and communication technologies is defined as a basic human right, right? And I would have thought that that kind of ends the conversation and makes it clear for everybody that they should care about it. However, usually, as I mentioned, that's not the case. So what really convinces people to care about web accessibility is usually the money involved. And maybe you will come back to this if you work in accessibility. But usually where I start is talking about, of course it matters that accessibility benefits people with disabilities, right? But humans have a hard time relating to experiences that are other than their own. And so it helps to open up the conversation and say, okay, how can I make this relate to you and the experience that you have in your surrounding maybe? And that opens up there's this illustration by Microsoft where they're talking about permanent, temporary, and situational limitations, right? And so, yes, we have people with disabilities, and it's their right to have and participate equally on the web. But also, there are folks who may be temporarily limited or situationally limited, like when you're holding a baby or you're pushing your bike, or maybe you're in a really loud environment or in a really quiet one and you want to turn on captions, for example, right? Because you can't turn up the sound. So all of these cases in which web accessibility is super beneficial and we all benefit from it. And even if you don't benefit from it now, then we're all going to get older, right? We were just discussing we're not as young as we used to be, and this is not going to stop, unfortunately. So we're all going to get older, but we want to continue using the technologies that we love, right? And so this is really relevant for all of us. Accessibility in this way means more customers. Oh boy. I'm sorry. And again, this leads back to the money aspect of it, right? And so there's a number by the World Health Organization that estimates that 15 to 20% of the global population are experiencing some form of disability throughout their lifetime, right? And that is a lot of people. And so if you can find a way to collect data on what kind of maybe audiences you are also missing, that's going to really make your case if you want to convince your company to invest in web accessibility, right? And what I found really helpful is trying to collect the data on the lost opportunities. That's a really difficult thing to do in a business process sometimes, but it really helps to show why it would have been important or why it is important going in the future. Accessibility is also regulated, right? And so all of these brands that you see here have something in common, and that is that they got sued based on accessibility violations. And now all of these brands are US-based brands, and they got sued in the US. But I mean, that's gonna hopefully change a little bit in the future, right? There are different kinds of regulations in different countries. You have the Section 508 in the US. You have an Accessible Canada Act. You have the Equality Act in the UK. And in Norway, you also have an anti-discrimination law. And kind of the elephant in the room is the laws that are coming to the EU, right? Because maybe some of you haven't worked with accessibility before, have become aware of it because of the law. So we have the European Accessibility Act. It's a landmark European law that's going to come into place in June this year. And it's going to affect, or it concerns everyday products and services. For example, things like banking, messaging services, e-commerce, transportation. And so far, mainly the accessibility laws that have been in the US and in the EU were concerning something like travel, institutions that need to be used, like universities or more governmental organizations, they have so far already been regulated. But now this is actually shifting to a lot of customers or to a lot of businesses that haven't been regulated as such before. And the e-commerce part is something that is kind of scaring in quotation marks. A lot of folks where they're thinking, okay, so does it affect my clients? Does it affect my users? Am I going to be regulated? Right, so that's why it's really picking up steam here. There are different implementations of this European law in all the different member states, and the penalties are also a little bit different, but similar. So, like with everything in the EU, it's the same, but not really. And the norm that is kind of the base for this law is called EN 301549. And it's the accessibility requirements, and it's loosely based on, or not loosely, it's based on the WCAG that I was mentioning earlier, right? And so while it's not exactly the same, if you are accessible based on the WCAG, you are on a really, really good way to fit under that law. And the clock is ticking, right? So it's coming into effect in June 28th in this year. Maybe some of you remember how it was when the GDPR was rolling around. All of a sudden, it was really soon, and people started freaking out, and there was a big commotion, and then it was already time. So I have a feeling it might happen like this a little bit, but we'll see what's going to happen. But now to the maybe as technical people more interesting part. What can we do about this? Right now that we know all of this. Now that we know that it's a problem, what do we do? There is a report by WebAIM. It's called WebAIM 1 Million, and they're looking at the most common issues across all the different websites, the most popular websites. They crawled them automatically, and they had a look. What are the most common accessibility issues? Right, on all of these pages. And the number one thing that goes wrong the most is insufficient color contrast. So the background and the foreground in comparison don't have enough color contrast. Then we have missing alternative text. So you have an image, maybe it doesn't load or somebody can't see it. You want textual support for that, right? You want to have an alternative version to support that. Then we have missing form input labels, empty links and buttons. Happens quite a lot, especially on mobile, when you have maybe an icon that represents a button, but there's no label attached to that. And missing document language, right? So you want to explain, or you want to let the browser know what language the content on your page is in, so that it can be announced by assistive technology, for example. So people get this wrong a lot, and that's why, actually, unfortunately, only 3% of the web pages in this report are accessible, right? Or are without those automated errors, which doesn't necessarily mean they're fully accessible, but for the sake of the argument. And so now we're going to have a look at how we can actually address these issues in Chrome and maybe find them and address them. And let's dive right in. So the first thing, I'm sure many of you have run a Lighthouse report before. It's an automated test that finds all sorts of issues, and you can actually test for performance, for best practices, SEO, and you can do many things, and you can also test just for accessibility purposes, right? And so there used to be a video there. Well, I will show you here on my employer's page anyway. So you run the test, it gives you a score. We were also joking earlier that 95, that sounds really good, right? We'll get to that. Let's not get too excited just yet. But basically, it's telling me the only issue that it found is the color contrast, right? Like we mentioned, the most common issue, so that's kind of represented here in this case. And then we can have a look, okay, where did it go wrong? And we see there are some texts that have very low color contrast against the foreground, and how to fix that. And then what I really love about this test is that it tells me, Great, so this is the issues that we found automatically, but do check these items manually because an automated test can never find everything, right? And so we can go in here and then we can have a look at all the things that it couldn't check for. For example, are the keyboard controls focusable? So if I tab around my page, will I actually know where my focus is and will it be visible? Are there elements, interactive elements, indicating their purpose? If I find a button, will I know what to do with it? Is there a logical tab order? Also something that couldn't be tested. And so on, right? So you find all of these issues that you have to check for manually also in here. And then we also see what it passed and what doesn't apply. But this is super helpful because besides the great score that we got here, we also see there are actually some things I couldn't check for, and those are really, really crucial, right? If I can't move around with a keyboard on my page, I don't know where my focus is, I'm going to be really disoriented as a user. So that's something to look out for. Okay. Now, just beware, a good score doesn't necessarily mean that your page is really accessible. The article is also linked in the end. It's by Manuel Matuzovic, who had a really fun time with exploring how he could mess up a page but still get a good score, right? So it's just a fun experiment to show that the score is a great start and is really good to kind of dive into things deeper, but is not a guarantee for accessibility, right? So that's a really fun read, highly recommended. And now, we want to get deeper into how we can use Chrome DevTools to explore accessibility. We could, for example, go in the accessibility pane over there and have a look, for example, at the ARIA attributes. So the ARIA attributes are accessible rich internet applications. They help you when you can't communicate with the semantic elements that you have, you can't convey the information that you may need to convey. And so you can use the ARIA attributes to, for example, and what they did here is we have ARIA controls, we have an ARIA selected, where there's an ARIA labeled by, right? Like, so we can give additional information where the native HTML couldn't convey that. So we can inspect that here. We can also have a look at the source order. So we can see this is something that was mentioned in the manual check, that you have to check if the tab order is in a logical flow, right? And so you can visualize the source order and see in which order the different elements will be reached when somebody uses a keyboard, for example. Also really important. And then we can enable the full page accessibility tree. So I can check a little tick box, and this little icon here at the top appears. And I can use that icon to toggle between the accessibility tree and the DOM, right? And so if I toggle that, I will actually see in there what, for example, a screen reader or any kind of assistive technology would receive. And that can be really helpful if you want to check maybe why is something not announced, why is something announced in the way that it is, to find any kind of bugs related to that. And here for example, we can see there's a link. It is focusable, that is great, but it also says try for free. And now as a user, I wouldn't actually know what I'm trying for free, right? So that's a different problem, but it's definitely something to look out for, and where the accessibility tree can be really helpful to kind of toggle that and to go back and forth between the DOM and the accessibility tree. We can also go for a more visual approach. So I mentioned the number one thing that is going wrong is low color contrast, right? And we want to aim for, with the AA level, we want to aim for 4.5 to 1 aspect ratio. And then the AAA is a little bit more strict, right? And so for the color contrast, we can, of course, inspect. And I can actually also show that in my different tab. So we have here the potato, and we see that might be a little bit small, but we can see that we're passing the color contrast because it's 3.2. Now you're saying, wait, but you just told us it's 4.5. If the font is larger and bold, then it gets lowered down to 3. However, now if I select that and I inspect my color here and I look at the color contrast, I can even ask the DevTools to fix it for me, right? And so I can get a suggestion as to how would I have to adjust the color to still be in line with what I was going for visually, but still look nice and to be in line with the color contrast. All right. Another thing that I could be doing, wait, I'm just gonna take one more sip. Would be to go into the CSS overview, and I can capture basically the visuals of my page and get an overview of all the different colors, and then I can see where are the contrast issues, which colors go together in terms of background and foreground, and how could I fix it if they don't quite work out, right? Then I could also go into the rendering mode to emulate different kinds of visual deficiencies, right? And by default, it's no emulation, but I could go for example, for blur division here. And then I can see how do different kinds of users with different kinds of disabilities or impairments perceive my page. Of course, it's not 100% accurate. Of course, real experiences are different, but it gives you a first glimpse of how different kinds of users may be interacting with your page, right? And so we could also go for something like reduced contrast when the weather is nice, like today. Then maybe people are looking at their website or your website on their phone. They're going to need a higher contrast to be able to perceive what's on that page, right? And then you could also simulate different kinds of visual impairments or total color blindness here, for example. And you can also emulate reduced motion. Also really important if you're using a lot of animations, for example. Right. So we almost made it. Those are some of the things that you can do with Chrome DevTools to figure out if your website or the project that you're working on is accessible or near accessibility. And of course, now you're saying that's all really great, but how do I even start? And of course, in an ideal world, it would be perfect if we could start with accessibility from the start. It would save us a lot of time and money. It's always easier to do something right from the beginning. But in the real world, that's usually not the case. In the real world, we deal with all these legacy projects, and it's really difficult to introduce accessibility on top of that once the mess has been done. Where I started for my current company was I did an audit on our design system because we're using our own design system. And I thought we can start from the components. And once we fix that, we can trickle down the changes into the app, right? We start small, also to get everybody acquainted. It's a new topic for many people. How can we kind of smooth that experience out and not create a lot of frustration? And so we started with these smaller components, are trickling down the changes and slowly working towards more complex interactions within our own app and how to make them accessible. Of course, it's amazing to introduce guardrails, also to streamline communication and to get everybody on board. That's really great to introduce automated testing, but it should not fully replace manual testing, right? There's a big importance in manual testing, and if you can, always include user testing, users who are using natively those assistive technologies, right? People with disabilities who could help you test, for example. It's important to define the goals. So if you're looking at the different levels of accessibility, what do you want to reach? What is maybe realistic? And what are also within your own capabilities? Like what are your resources, right? And then identify quick wins and low-hanging fruit, right? So a little bit buzzwordy, but it really helps to look at something and say like, hey, okay, so maybe if I fix this issue, it's going to make it so much easier to, maybe it's eliminating a focus trap or something, and you're going to create a much better experience for a user, because now maybe you have a workaround so that somebody who's relying on the keyboard or assistive technology can actually navigate your page, rather than going in somewhere and adding an ARIA label that is a nice to have and maybe requires some research, right? So it's really a matter of evaluating, but of course it all is important. It's just a matter of like how you prioritize, right? And also something that we are doing is looking at the most common user journey. It was clear from the start that I wasn't going to be able to fix the whole app at once. So we're looking at what are we doing, or what are our users doing most frequently, and how can we create the most benefits for them in a short term, and then go from there, right? So just some food for thought. If any of you have any experience with that, I'm really happy to chat afterwards also. I'm sure you have some great ideas. And that's already mostly it from my side, just a few takeaways. And this is, you can scan this. Maybe let me know if it works. So, see some happy faces? Works, thank you. Thank you. The slides are in there. Wait. The slides are in there, and also the tools, some articles from Google, and some additional tools if you don't want to rely on Chrome DevTools. There's also other tools you can use for testing, of course. And so if you're taking anything away, except that I should have taken a cough drop before starting to talk, it should be that it concerns all of us. Accessibility concerns all of us, and it's a big feat depending on what kind of project you're working on. So take it a small step at a time and kind of work incrementally from there. Make sure you always consider your users and also think beyond the binary. Try to think what kind of other perspectives can I include, and what would they maybe need from my product. And yeah, you can do this directly in the browser if you want to. There are also lots of other cool tools. And thank you so much for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.